Everybody, thank you for joining us. My name is Louis-Philippe Champagne. I'm the Associate VP for Public Affairs and Industry Practices at the CCA. If you've attended these briefings before, you'll be used to see me introduce our in-house economic, Mario Baker. I will start with a slightly different presentation today. For those of you who are not yet aware, Mario has left the CCA for a great job with Bloomberg's. We're really happy for him and wish him all the best. We are now in the process of finding a new economic on our team. The report we're presenting today is Mario's final report that he wrote and developed in full before leaving a few weeks ago. He unfortunately could not be with us to present it today. So we'll do something slightly different. I will be presenting that report on his behalf, and starting next quarter for the report published at the end of summer, we will have a new staff member providing the report for you. Of course, to state the obvious, I am not an economist. I'm a public affairs professional, but I have brought here my good friend, Charles Bernard from Impact Public Affairs. Many of you will be familiar with Impact. They are a third-party firm that we rely on quite extensively for our IL Day every fall and currently for election campaign. The Impact team has a lead economics, which is Charles, who has devoted his career to these wonderful numbers. He's here to make sure that if I say anything wrong or crazy, he'll stop me and jump in. And we've also made sure that some of the more technical data set here will be presented by Charles. Charles, thank you for being with us. Very much appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. And yeah, just interesting to talk about your industry. And I'll try to give a bit more macroeconomic insights to the more detailed industry insights that LP is going to provide.
Thank you. As usual, we'll start with a short presentation in a PowerPoint format. All the information counted in this presentation is in the economic report, every chart, every data set. If you have any kind of question, feel free to refer to the document that is now available on our website. Member from my team will make sure to put this in chat throughout the presentation. And at the end, we'll make sure to keep a good amount of time for question if you have any. This, of course, can be specifically on the data and the state of the economy, but also more broadly on the work we're doing around tariff and the election, if that's of interest to you. So without further ado, I'll jump into the presentation by sharing my screen here. Give me 1 second. Can I get some thumbs up if this shows properly? Looking good. Awesome. So let's jump into some of the data that you're used to. Every quarter, we try to keep the same data set to replicate quarter over quarter. This gives us good perspective on what might be to come, starting with output, activity, and the economy. We have some key items here that have been listed. First and foremost, sorry, I'm just missing. Give me 1 second here. I'll just have a bit of a technical challenge here. There we go. Perfect. Some key takeaways here that you'll find in our executive summary of the actual document, the report on the very first page. First, looking at Canada's economy as a whole, that grew 0.5% in Q4. This is a modest gain that follows the 0.3 increase from Q3 2024, but it is a positive trend that we've been monitoring in the recent quarter after some time of challenging economic growth, primarily due to interest rate. We will cover this in great detail in a minute. I do want to point out, as you see here, the number on screen, the entirety of the report is our second report of 2025. There's always a bit of a lag on the data collection. This is data that has been published since our last report in January, but the entirety of the data is from 2024. This is looking specifically at Q4 and also some historical data from the year. If you look at that full year growth, GDP grew 1.6%. This resilience was partly due to interest rate cuts that we've seen in the end of 24. Similar quality narrative for the industry with a growth of 1.1% for construction, but a different portrait year to year with contraction of 0.3. You'll remember from previous discussion, I'll bring this chart here that you've seen before, the post-economic challenges of the post-pandemic has been quite significant. If you look on the left side of this chart, this starts all the way back to Q1 2019, pre-pandemic. What we see, of course, is significant disruption over Q2 2020 to Q1 2022, and then some stabilization and most significantly some contraction of the sector in the economy during that high interest rate period. These three dots at the very far right is that modest and steady growth that we've experienced in the last 3 quarters. So we are hoping that this trend continues. Once again, I'll remind you, this is Q4 data. So this was before Donald Trump took the sermon and became president of the United States. We knew at this point that he won the election. It was just not inaugurated yet. So any of the executive order or uncertainty that followed is not captured in this data set. Let's look into the big item here, that dotted line, which is the interest rate that significantly impacted the economy. And this is the same situation around the world, of course. I'll turn to Charles here to go into a bit more detail on the trends and the pattern we've seen.
Yeah, thank you, LP. No, I just think that the dotted line that was presented in the graph kind of perfectly aligns with some of the more I'd say positive results that we've seen over the last quarters, just as a representation of an environment where credit is a bit more obtainable, and that's a trend that once again I know industries across the country were not only expecting but were patiently waiting for. Now I know if you look on the screen, there's the predictions for the target rate at the end of 2025. So currently we're sitting at 2.75, and there's predictions of many financial institutions saying that we will see a reduction by the end of 2025. This will be an interesting discussion because, as you know, monetary policy and the Bank of Canada only has one lever in terms of dealing with economic or financial crisis, and the Bank of Canada will have to evaluate, and we'll talk about it a bit more, what will be the real impacts on inflation from the tariff discussion and essentially trade war with the US. And depending on their understanding of the effects it will have on the consumers in Canada, they might have a different approach to their target rate and the monetary policy. So that's why I think, and many people believe that right now it's a position where the Bank of Canada is sitting down and observing what's going to happen. Some of the measures on the trade war side has been a bit more controlled or a bit more targeted than maybe a month ago. So the inflation projections have not been as bad. And if that's the case, then you could see the Bank of Canada have an approach where they reduce the target rate, stimulate investment, stimulate consumers to get into the market. But that will all be after observing the inflation effect of the tariff war. So that'll be something to track over the next few months. So yeah, and I wanted, because we're talking about GDP growth, that's not industry specific, that's the whole economy. But the Bank of Canada and TD, they've built a graph where they show two scenarios. So if you look at the deep purple, the dark purple, this is their scenario one in terms of GDP growth, where it's a trade war that only lasts for a few weeks, and that we're settling down on maybe still some tariffs on both sides of the border, but a bit more measured approach, and the impacts on GDP would be obviously negative. But not as negative as the second scenario, where it's the light purple line, where they're talking about a scenario where it's a full-on trade war for a year, and then you could see the effects not only as they're more sharp, but they're also a bit more sustained over the next quarters. So that'll be something of interest. And the dotted lines is TD forecast. TD, and I have experience working with them, they have a more optimistic approach to it, especially on the inflation side. So that represents their portrait. But the economy, once again, macroeconomically speaking, is going to go through major changes, and depending on how acute these changes are, the effect on the economy will be different.
Thank you, Charles. And before I move on to the investments and interest rates, I do want to point out the obvious here. We're living in a bit of an uncertain time with a lot of question marks more than answers. One of them, of course, is what's happening with the US as we look at forecasts, potential trade war and whatnot. But the other one is, of course, the federal election. So I think a lot will be known in a few weeks when we have a better sense of what's the next round of announcement for tariff from Donald Trump, what's the man in power in Langevin Block in Ottawa, and to an extent what the government policy will be in regards of both their influence to the fiscal policy and financial policies. So on investments, a few key takeaways here. Investment in building construction grew 1% in Q4, reaching 64.5 billion. This marks the sixth consecutive quarter increase. This was led in great part by the non-residential construction sector. The housing still remain challenging. We've seen throughout the past few months with housing starts that non-residential construction contributed nearly 89% of the quarterly gain. Institutional and industrial construction were also key driver with industrial investment hitting record high. For the full year, construction investment rose 2.4% with a 3% gain in residential and in non-residential sector. We have that chart here again that you'll recognize very similar to the one we've seen before with a different data point. Clearly a correlation between those investments and the state of the economy at large. And again, that growing interest rate that then contracted had a direct impact here on your total residential and non-residential project in contraction there from Q4 2022 all the way to the end of 23, and then some back and forth around that 0%. Charles, do you have anything to add on this?
Yeah, I'd also say, because I think when we just look at the GDP growth for the industry as well, and while there's growth, it might have been as sometimes a direct reflection of the industry and the positive effect of the interest rates going down. One thing I have to say, and people in the industry will know better than I do, but some of the positive effects, and we're seeing it in Q4 2024, of a more digestible credit environment with the lower interest rates. For certain sectors, that effect is captured more rapidly. If you're looking at discretionary items, whether it's auto or just simple retail products, they could see the effects of the interest rates going down more rapidly for consumers. In the investment sector and construction center, that effect can be absorbed, and it will be absorbed, and I think we're seeing some of it right now, or we have been recently. But the reflection on the hard data sometimes takes a bit more time because the projects themselves go through a longer process. So that's something I think is of interest. And then if we go to the next slide, LP, I think it's it's another graph that I used from the data on the report. So I would refer you once again to go to the report that has been built by the CCA team. Wonderful report. And there's mentions about the provincial growth and especially non-residential sectors within the industry. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it just represents some of the regional disparities that have been observed within the construction industry, which also sometimes make the analysis a bit more nuanced, whether it's the advocacy analysis or sometimes the analysis of the economic effects that's going on your industry, just because regionally they are absorbed or reflected in different ways. So if you look at Manitoba, and this is industrial construction, in terms of increase and growth, we're seeing major results. And then if we'll talk about it later, but if you look at the issue of skilled labor and needing workers, some of that those concerns are directly reflected in how dynamic the industry was over the last quarter. So once again, go to the report if you want more regional breakdown. I think it's important considering your role in your own provinces.
Thank you, Charles. And speaking of workforce, this is a perfect segue to our next segment, of course, on labor market and productivity, which remain a key discussion item and concern for the industry. Let's again look at some key item here. Construction employ now around 1.7 million people across Canada. We always tend to be stuck at that 1.5 or 1.6. This is a growing industry, and that workforce keep growing, and the need for worker also keep growing. The employment rose by 1.4% in Q4, adding 22,000 worker Canada-wide. Most provinces saw an employment gain, with Alberta, Ontario, Saskatchewan leading the way. Notably, non-residential and infrastructure projects are helping sustain employment in region with strong investment activity. Over 2024, total employment grew by 0.3%, marking the third straight year of increase, through growth was slower in 22 and 23. Construction job vacancies remain elevated and a problem, around 42,000 vacant position. We'll go over that in detail in the next few slides. The first one I want to bring up is this map that we have in every report. I hope you like it as much as I do. I love this document, especially when you compare them quarter over quarter. You'll see here, I'll turn your attention right away to Manitoba. We were mentioning a minute ago how they've been sustained by important growth in the sector, almost 3,000 new jobs for Manitoba there. Sorry, that's Saskatchewan. That would make more sense. Significant growth in Saskatchewan, not in Manitoba. Thank you for my geography class here. But nevertheless, important growth in the prairies, in many sectors. Now, for provinces where you see more modest growth or contraction, it's important to put into perspective that this is a quarter over quarter. So in many cases, you have a very strong Q3 or coming up Q1 25 that can have a temporary lull in between the two. Nevertheless, what we see is Canada-wide significant increase across the board in employment. This also correlates to the vacancies, which I think is important to point to. You'll see this chart that I personally love. I bring up in every presentation I have, which again goes back to 2015. This is the entire last decade to give you a perspective of the trend in workforce. What we see here is pre-pandemic all the way to 2018, give or take. We had a pretty good situation for the construction sector. We were way past the 2008 economic crisis. We had some stability in the industry. And what we had there is even below average vacancies in the low to mid 20,000. Still not zero. There's been a profound chronic need for workers in construction for many decades now. This is driven in great part by the lack of trade worker. But before COVID, things were looking up to us. COVID created that uncertainty and fluctuation around the middle of the chart. But then really the problem here is the post-COVID recovery, the economic uncertainty and rapid growth of the industry that led to that last part on the right, where that purple line skyrocket and that red line goes and decline. That's the unemployment to vacancy ratio. And what we've seen there is vacancies reaching almost 90,000 vacant job in Canada. I remind you again, this is currently available job in worksite that are in progress, not forecasts of who we need in the future. And we had some real challenge there in the summer 22, fall 22. You'll remember that our Hill Day was dedicated to that issue. The message I have from this slide really is that things have been slowly improving since then. If you go all the way to summer 24, we've contracted into the upper 30,000 job, which is still not zero, but a much better position to be in. In the last few months, we've seen a climb back up, mostly due to the demand in many sectors. Nevertheless, we are nowhere near the peak of that chart. We continue, of course, to advocate for better investment in workforce as this need to keep coming down, but it's a positive side for the industry. One of the key words we hear quite a lot in that regard is productivity. It's not always about just the number of workers, but how much output we get out of this. I'll turn to Charles once again to discuss a bit more the question of productivity.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a major political item in the next 4 years of politics here in Ottawa, and I think some of it is also emphasized or reinforced by the progressive or at least narrative about decoupling from the United States on a few elements, right? And as soon as many industries were saying we can't be as dependent on the American market as we were before, well, the questions rapidly became, well, we have issues of our own, right? Interprovincial trade barriers and all that, but there's also a lack of productivity within the Canadian workforce, and that's pretty much across all industries. So if you look at, and I know it's quite an eye chart with the 6 different charts, but if you look at the bottom ones, right? Hours worked have increased over the last few years. Total numbers of jobs have been increasing. So that's human capital being invested in, right? And wages also, they've been stabilized, but have been going up. So that's more human capital being invested. But the output that we're getting from that human capital within the industry is slowing down. And that's a comment on the industry, but it's also a comment within the whole of the Canadian economy. And I don't have the chart now, but if you compare that dynamic with the Americans or our G7 partners, you would see that Canada is in a dire need of better productivity, and some is rooted in access to financing and capital, which I know is one of the main concerns of the industry. But just to put it in perspective as we move forward over the next year, in our advocacy efforts, but also in just tracking what's going on in Parliament, I think productivity will be something that the construction industry has data and insights to talk about. And I also believe it won't be a partisan issue as much as others are. So that'll be interesting to track as we go forward again.
Thank you. And as we mentioned, productivity, of course, workforce remains an important tracking metric for us at the CCA. I'll also give a shout out to BuildForce, who are a great partner of us in collecting that data and projecting trend for the industry. Significant need for more worker, not just for current vacancies, but projected for years to come as we see a lot of worker going into retirement. Let's speak about something that is very timely, in my opinion. Of course, the construction material and trade vulnerability. This is our quarterly focus for this report. As you know, every quarter we try to bring a bit of a flavor to the report beyond the traditional metric that we follow through every quarter. The last two reports, this one and the January one, have been dedicated to the trade reality of Canada. It will not be a surprise. This is the biggest agenda issue in Ottawa right now. Hopefully, this is our last one dedicated to this. I'm hopeful that by the summer, things will have shifted, but this might be a bit too hopeful on my end. I will turn to this chart that you'll find in the report toward the middle, maybe closer to the end of the report, which look at trade vulnerabilities of different categories of equipment and material for construction. I should preface by saying construction material is not the entirety of the cost of a project. There's a significant part of that cost that is labor and project management itself. And nevertheless, it is a substantial part of the things we build, be it bridge and roads and buildings and houses, that have embedded costs related to material. If that material is vulnerable to tariff, in this case, coming from the US, or overall uncertainty from abroad, cost escalation can be a real challenge for a contractor at the entire level of the supply chain, from trade contractor all the way to the GCs. What we see here, there's a number of key takeaway in import resilience to the US. I'll present this to you in a slightly different format here on a X and Y chart, which I've been using in my presentation quite a bit. This showcases on the vertical axis the share of total use of any specific categories. The best example I can give you, I'm sorry, it's a bit small, there's a lot of text here. In the very top left, you have that purple dot, which is ready-mix concrete. Obviously, we have concrete in the vast majority of the project we work with in great amount, but this is a very local material. You don't move this around once it's mixed as concrete. The dependence there is next to zero, and the usage is quite high. The rest of the chart will showcase a number of different categories of material that have different percentage of usage, from wood to steel to different type of specialized product. And then the x-axis, the horizontal axis, look at the dependence specifically to trade. How much of this do we produce in Canada versus how much we need to bring from abroad? The color and the size of the dot specifically represent the category of good for the color, and then the size of dot represent the dollar value. Keep in mind that percentage of use and dollar value are not always correlated. Low value, high demand material like concrete might be very high, but not the biggest dot. Some smaller percentage are very expensive material, and then we'll have a much bigger dot. I'll turn your attention here to the gray dot first, which is a significant concern of the industry. We've provided a thorough memoir to the government on this matter recently. These gray dots are electronic and electrical equipment parts. You'll notice that every single one of them are on the right side of the chart, beyond the 50%, in some case very close to the 100% at electric light bulbs and tube, for example. This is your electrical contractor bread and butters. This is light switch, wire, power box, whatever. And unfortunately, we don't produce a whole lot of that in Canada. We do have some local production, but we have significant amount of it being produced in the US and in Mexico. And the hard reality is that electronic equipment in North America need to be CSA standard. You cannot just bring a light switch from Europe. It's just not the same system. So what we see here is, for a different level of usage, a significant concern for electrical equipment. Same thing for industrial machinery, equipment and part. If you have anyone from the civil sector here, there is a key concern here for maintenance and upgrade of vehicles. Those are the two orange dots that you have, again, toward the right side of the screen. This could be a concern, and we've seen a number of suppliers trying to move operation or bolster operation abroad outside the US to circumvent the potential risk that we have there in the US. I'll close on the green and blue dot. This is respectively forestry product, wood, and the blue dot, steel. What you see here is a wide diversity of dependencies. On some of the steel product, for example, you can look at prefab material building parts, very much on the left side, but metal valves and pipes, very much dependent for plumbers, for example, far to the right as well. So really what I want to point to here is how diverse specific material can be in terms of dependence to the US, and how much uncertainty that can bring for your GC that may have very different reality from one trade to another, and how threatening that can be for specific trade where they see the majority of their good dependent on that US import. Let's move to business condition. This is something that I really like. It is a bit of a subjective analysis that look at public opinion first and foremost, but really show a nice picture of where the industry is going and what the concerns of people are, especially in terms of trend and change when you look at this quarter over quarter. What you have on this chart, again, available in the report, is a key concern of the industry over the past many quarters. You have here at the bottom, the purple, which is all the skill employee acquisition or retention matters. Everything in the green section relate to the cost of project in some way, obtaining financing, cost of insurance, fluctuation in consumer demand. And then on the top, the blue section is your input costs of material, rising inflation, transportation, etc. And then on the other axis, left to right, is provinces and territories, of course. And what you can see from that data is first, a number of rapidly changing concern in some region, right? I'll turn to Manitoba right here. If you look at recruiting skill employee, 38.2% concern there, or increasing concern. While you're looking at BC, for example, you have a 24.6 decline there in green. So what you see is from quarter to quarter, some adjustment on how the perception here, again, subjective perception is of some of these key concern, but also the trend from province to province. For example, if you look at the center of the chart, you can clearly see that the workforce problem are very severe in Quebec and Ontario and Manitoba, also in Alberta, a little less in other provinces. Meanwhile, the rising cost of input inflation was a broad concern last quarter. What you can see here in Atlantic provinces, Newfoundland, PEI, Nova Scotia, is a bit of a correction there. Interesting chart, in my opinion. I invite you to look at it in the report and use this as best as you can. Charles, you want to bring in some info here?
No, I think it's truly important. It's a great slide, and I think not only does it take the pulse of your industry over the last few months, but it's also going to be interesting and to see how it differs to maybe that data in a quarter or two moving forward. And I'm sorry to always bring it back to the uncertainty that the industry and the Canadian economy is facing, but that's truly where some of the better insights will show in terms of, for example, cost of production, risk of inflation. Those dynamics will be exacerbated, or at least some of the concerns, whether it's the consumers or the industries, will be affected. So not only take a snapshot of this for direct purposes right now, but it'll be interesting to do a comparison as we move forward, as how the priorities have changed depending on what's going on with the American counterpart.
On that next slide, I just want to point out the trend here year over year, which is a bit of a dire picture, but won't be a surprise that the uncertainty is a concern. The vertical axis here look at the positive respondents, so a decline is a negative thing. And what you can see from 22, 3, and 4, on many of these issues, is a contraction of the positive response, right? Whether it is on skill employee, whether it is the cost of input, the labor force, transportation, there is a bit of a growing uncertainty and, of course, more and more concern industry-wide. I think it is important not just to look at the quarter data, but look at this annual year over year to see where we are heading forward into 25. To wrap up that section on material costs and inflation, I do want to bring up a few key items here. Charles, do you want to take this one or should I?
Yeah, I can go and
Go ahead. Yeah.
I'll go over the key items, and I think and at the end you'll see that I added a few charts talking once again about inflation perception for consumers and the effect it's going to have on spending, because I think once again the inflation data is of interest for your direct operations at the moment, but this part of the equation will also be tremendously affected by the uncertainty and the macroeconomics of the situation. So you could already see in the chart that we'll show you the volatility in material costs, and that volatility is directly rooted in some of the uncertainty generated by tariffs, shifting trade policies, and uncertain supply chains. And the uncertain supply chains was also an issue after COVID. So we're trending in a similar situation where the industry is facing a whole lot of uncertainty about their dependence on the U.S. market, for example, and that has an effect on the prices. Q4 in terms of increase is 0.4%, which is a reflection of sustained demand for key materials. For example, 7% for lumber and wood. So that is a underlying comment about some of the dynamism of the industry that we've seen over the last quarter, which is a positive. But the BCPI, the Building Construction Price Index, increased by less than 1% in Q4. So at the same time, there's economic dynamism within the industry, but we're still seeing the slowest pace since before the pandemic in terms of inflation growth. So it's an equilibrium that's kind of with the slowing or the reduction of interest rates. I'm sure it's an equilibrium that business conditions were a bit easier to operate in that if you look at it only with that element, notwithstanding the labor and other challenges that that you're facing. One of the other element that I found was interesting is that the easing inflation pressures that were measured and our hard data wasn't necessarily reflected in business sentiment. So it might be the methodology of it that's different, but this dissonance or this disruption between business sentiment and the easing down of inflation, or at least the stabilization of inflation, might be related more to regional differences and different dynamics and challenges that sectors, province by province, are facing. So that's an interesting element as well. But once again, if you look at this chart, it's mostly by the inflation growth or stabilization by so the price is going up for different types of products. So once again, quite of a night chart, but it's a bit more detailed in the report. So I would recommend just go, and if there's segments of products that you're interested in, there's a bit more detailed information on this. Next chart, please, LP. Which is similar. This is the BCPI, which I just mentioned, with a sustained and the slowest growth of inflation over since COVID. So we're that stabilization once again is something that not every industry has faced, and it's a trend that needs to be tracked for. Next chart, please.
I think it's useful to point out as well, once again, 2024 data, right? We don't have the numbers from Q1 25 yet, which was post Donald Trump inauguration and executive order. That's going to be interesting to see if any significant change happened there.
Yeah. And yeah, same thing. Once again, I mentioned regional differences that might skew some of the results that we got on the business sentiments, right? The difference between some regions in the country compared to others in terms of price indexes changes over the last quarter are quite major. So once again, I think it not only underlines the dynamic that makes it important to the advocacy both regionally, provincially, and federally, but it's also a key reminder that in your role within your own provincial or region that you operate in, information and data and sharing insights is as an economist, at least personally, is something that we can only understand from the experience on the ground, because we can't use the numbers and make a broad statement on inflation, for example, and saying it that's the reality of the construction industry. It's a bit more nuanced than that, and doing what we're doing today right now is the association towards you, but the information coming back is also key in that regard, in my opinion. That's me more of the economist talking in a way of intelligence gathering, but I think it's important to note. And then I think I ended with two more slides, LP.
That's the outlook for 25, yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about
well,
it?
I can start and of course jump in as you see fit. It's a slide I always like. It's trying to look into the future here, because of course the data is not there. But what we see, of course, from trends, from information we have, is some significant risks that push the industry down, the economy at large, but also bring ourselves up. To state the obvious, increased geopolitical risk remains present. It's easy to forget about the rest of the world and just think, well, it's Trump and the tariff and the threat and the uncertainty that comes out of it. But let's keep in mind that pre-Trump, we were in a very uncertain time. The war in Ukraine, the tension in the Middle East, it does create significant disruption, especially for our supply chain, even beyond tariff. Of course, right now, the tariff takes the top of the leader chart when it comes to disruption. But let's keep in mind that even if this goes away and we all go back to normal, which I don't think will happen tomorrow, there is still a unique environment around the world that creates some tension for the movement of financing, but also for the movement of goods. Tariff uncertainty is down here as well, of course, for the same reason. As long as we don't know where the US is going, it's going to be a challenging time for the industry. What has become apparent now in the first few months of 2025 is that it's not so much the tariff themselves that hurt the industry, it is the created uncertainty that comes out of the White House that doesn't allow us to adapt to any kind of percentage. If in February we would have had a blanket 10 or 25% tariff on the industry, that would have been detrimental for all of Canada and for construction, but at least we could have planned ahead and adjust accordingly. Right now, what we see is both supplier and construction company and many sector trying to adjust to changing landscape from one day to the other, trying to balance what it means for the company, and it's a real challenge. The political uncertainty also relate to what's happening in Canada. We will know in a week who the next prime minister and government here in Canada. The two main parties have very similar platform that were released today, so it's not going to be the massive change that we might have expected. But nevertheless, there is uncertainty on the response to the US and the direction for Canada. These key takeaways are potential risk for the industry in 2025. But there is a upside to this, of course, with the gain we have here. Inflation continues to slow down thanks to the work of the central bank that they've made a number of good announcements in 24 and are continuing to very closely monitor that situation. This, of course, led to lower interest rates as they are correcting themselves. This is good news all across the board for developer, for construction company, as the cost of financing is coming down and the availability of project is coming back up. This is also bolstered by infrastructure investment. If there's one trend we've seen across both national campaign of the Conservative and Liberal is a desire to reinvest in infrastructure to stimulate the economy, to protect us from the trade uncertainties. If this is to become tangible policies, we can have a few quarters and potentially years of solid investment. Anything to add, Charles?
No, that's great, LP, and I think it captures well some of the like I wouldn't call it the yin and yang, but some of the opportunities that are positive and some of the challenges. And if you go to the next slide, there's a representation that I thought was interesting, and it's twofold. So we'll go one by one. But that's kind of the challenge of when you're talking about a tariff and the uncertainty. For me, that's a representation of generally speaking for the economy, but it will sure have an effect on the construction industry. How some of the behavior by consumers and investment and entrepreneurs will be affected by this uncertainty. Because if you look at this chart, this is from U.S. consumer inflation expectations, but this is something that once we'll have the data in Canada, it'll be interesting to see, and it might be a carryover effect where you're already seeing in many sectors consumers believing and being pretty much captured by the fact that cost of goods and cost of living, whatever, if they are big or small ticket items, is going to go up. So you're seeing I work closely with the car dealership association. You're already seeing consumers flocking towards the dealerships because they're expecting inflation to go up, even if right now the inflation levels are more than sustainable. And even if the predictions from the BOC aren't as negative as we thought maybe a month ago. But will be important because if we entered in this environment where consumers really believe that costs will go up, like we're seeing in the States right now, even if the inflation hasn't followed expectations, behavior becomes irrational, and this will have an effect on spending at a consumer level, but could have an effect on the investment level as well. But they might be a bit more protected from it. But I think it's a trend that needs to be taken into account in terms of some of the fear and the uncertainty that comes within the discussion and the trade war. And that's why it's important, I believe, and politicians have made it clear in the election of having a plan on how to deal with the U.S. situation. It's not only for political positioning. I also believe it's to remove uncertainty within the market, because that kills market, or at least puts a spin on the industry and the market that's often negative. And we're also already seeing this in forecasts. LP, if you want to go to the next slide, if that's Canadian data in terms of consumer spending that was for Q1 2025. Right. And this is for me like a representation, and now we'll get the data for Q2 very soon. It's a representation of how, even if there's not a real effect on inflation in Canada because of the trade war, because we haven't seen it yet. Catherine, we'll make sure you get the slides. if there's that dynamic, but consumers are already changing their behavior because of uncertainty of what's going to happen. And we've seen a drastic reduction in consumer spending. And that forecast is the same for the next quarter, even if the real hard data on the economy, we're talking about inflation, access to capital, haven't really changed. So that is something that I believe we should keep in mind when we're talking about the economy going forward in 2025, is there's a lot of behaviors that's going to be affected by what's in the news and not necessarily rooted in real economic data. And that spin, like I called it, as a negative effect. So I didn't want to be too pessimistic. I think LP did a great job in showing the elements that make it up, may give you reasons to be optimistic, to be fair. But on the other end of the equation, I think we need to be real about the political uncertainty results and the economic behavior that changed the dynamic compared to what we saw in 2024.
Thank you, Charles. Appreciate this. And this is what concludes our formal part of the briefing. We did pretty good on time, just 1 minute over our 40 minutes mark. So I appreciate your help there, Charles. And of course, we'll turn to the floor now. If you have any question on the information we provided today, the report itself that is now published on our website, and anything related to the subject matter, I encourage you to use the raise hand function. If you can find it, they changed it in Zoom a few days ago, and every meeting I'm on, people struggle to find the react option. Is that little heart. You can go in there and find your reaction, or put your question in text chat if you are not able to speak up. Let me just turn this up. Starting with our frequent flyer, Mike Carter from London.
LP, always a pleasure. I got a couple questions. One of them is fairly simple. On the business survey that you provided, does PP mean percent positive?
Percentage point.
And what the hell does that actually mean? Because as I'm looking at it, you go from negative 20 PP, BC, first thing difficulty, to Quebec 8.6 PP. Is that like a percentage change compared to the previous survey?
Precisely, yeah. It's a change in sentiment in percentage point quarter over quarter. Charles, you want to speak to the methodology here? You might be more familiar.
Well, it's explained well, and I understand, Mike. It's good to see you. Some of the once the first time you read it with the PP thing, it makes it complicated, but it's pretty straightforward. It's a quarterly study, so the changes within so it's a percentage change from Q4 through Q3 to Q4 essentially, and a positive result. And the question is, are you concerned about, right? Essentially, so if there's a positive number, that means people are more concerned about that specific item compared to the last survey, and a negative result saying that last time this was more of a concern than it is now. So by putting in a full chart, we wanted to identify how regionally there's worries that are more rooted in once again regional dynamics. But I understand the how complex it could look, but hopefully it's clear now.
Okay, my real questions actually are all related to tariffs. So I'll go to the chart that you provided. So I'm assuming that is the data that you provided. I'm looking at it. So when you look at American, the last one, that is the percentage of imports that are being sourced from the U.S. because the data doesn't make sense any other way. Is that
you're talking about the table here with percentage?
Yeah, you got three of them. The first one really doesn't make any difference because it's national. The second two are all about related to imports.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, from the US.
I'm only getting up there on your report. But that's how you read that correctly, right? So it would tell you something. So I put it in a spreadsheet, and I did stuff like, so if I was to look at HVAC equipment for Ontario, everybody could do it for their own province, it would be 57.4% of HVAC equipment is non-US related. Because I multiply the import reliance from the US, and I'm assuming that is a subsector of the import, because if it's
correct,
the data doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so the info we have, just to give you some background here, and we can dive down into methodology if that interests you further. The limitation we have is that StatsCan provide that import resilience or reliance by categories, not by product specifically. That would be a bit of a nightmare for them to collect. So that HVAC category, for example, we have the breakdown by province, specifically on the regional import from the US. These are the percentage that were correlated in the report, again, from Q4 of last year.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And is that sort of related to the discussions that we've had? A couple of them related to getting something like this. But then the other questions that I have are related to, have you pondered doing a tariff survey? Because I've been in conversation with our members constantly, and it's sort of a shit bag of an awful lot of people trying to do good, but not really knowing what good is. So they don't really know what they're doing. We're getting importers who are sharing tariffs with contractors. And so the 7.5% is just showing up as price. It's not showing up as tariff, which screws up the whole thing related to ever being able to get any remission. And I heard recently through the grapevine that there may actually be elimination of Canadian tariffs on certain key items for construction.
It's a messy situation. That come back to what I was saying in regards to the uncertainty being more damaging than tariff right now. A lot of actors trying to figure it out what the tariffs are on their product, let alone how they're going to move this up the supply chain. You mentioned the remission process that is very convoluted in terms of who claims it should be the importer, but who is that? Charles, I've been doing a lot of work on tariff, especially for the auto sector that is currently in the middle of it. That new updated remission process was specifically targeted to them. So Charles, you want to say a few things there?
Yeah, I think the remission. So the rumors about like the approach, the retaliation measure by Canada, I think, Mike, the basis you can work with is that they're reevaluating every day, right? Which makes make it messy, makes it also kind of makes it feel like that. At least we can try to communicate with them some reasons why. Some certain types of products or HS codes should be exempted from the retaliation measure. I think the dependence on American product is one of the main arguments they're looking at within the remission process. Because when I've talked with Finance Canada, they look at two things: is either is it part of an input to a final product that can't be found somewhere else in Canada. So if you check that case, you have a good argument for a remission process. But once again, the importer question is important as well. And the other aspect is like if it's a final product that's being imported to Canada, if that final product can only be found in the US, they would also think about the remission process, about giving a remission. Now, they were also flexible about if they agree on a specific HS code being targeted with remission, they would put a remission process on the HS code entirely instead of going line by line of products and just having companies like yours, your members like that like you have to have go through that process continuously. But they're still going through that process, and I'm not sure we'll get resolution on it rapidly because I think it's extremely convoluted, and they also don't know what's going to happen on the US side. If I look at the auto, right, we're the parts imports, the American tariffs on part imports are currently in place. So the Canadian government has a measure to kind of counteract that, but they don't know if that tariff on the US side will be removed. So the uncertainty makes it complicated, but I think communicating through the CCA and through your work with the government is still important. And I think the other item that's and I'm sure LP has mentioned it, but on the remission side, they don't want people applying for remission that don't have an actual case of they've been hit by tariffs, right? So a lot of right now is speculation, and people are doing the process to be proactive about it, but they can't really tell that any of their products got hit by a tariff because it's so messy and the application of it is complicated that they won't look at remission process for predictive tariff effects, right? So those are all the elements that we have to juggle with. And I understand it doesn't necessarily answer all of your questions, but I think LP is a great resource, and I can help on that end. But communicating and engaging with, I understand the election makes it a bit more complicated, but engaging with the government, there's still time because they're still evaluating what they'll do on that end.
Yeah, let me, I'll say one thing and then I'll shut up for good. Eaton.
Allegedly.
Eaton Systems will always be in Western University. No matter what the tariff is, they will not change out of their core electrical control systems. So that should be, and that's American. So I would say that should not have a tariff on it, as opposed to you can easily substitute out of Trane for LG, Mitsubishi on the HVAC, air source heat pump side, because it's a very well-developed world market. In point of fact, if you go from Trane to somebody else, you may actually find it's a better unit. You may end up paying a little bit more, but maybe a better unit, blah, blah, blah. So there's some of those subtleties where I would say in construction, if they can, acknowledge the Eaton, the core electrical, no matter what the price, they won't move off because they can't do it. But the other stuff is interchangeable. That's why I've always been going after this dependency stuff, because it helps clarify where perhaps some simple action would be most effective. Anyways, that's it. I shut up.
No, that's a good point. I think that's where the interest of the federal government is. Again, bearing the fact that there's currently no effective head to the government. A good point to mention on what you just said and what Charles was saying about communicating this to government is that we had this consultation process, and it was Wednesday 2 weeks ago, I think, or a week and a half ago, where the government was asking feedback on a very specific list of product planned to be implemented in April 2nd. Now, to state the obvious, this hasn't been implemented because we sort of dodged Deliberation Day beside the auto sector. This doesn't mean that the list is dead. It certainly doesn't mean that our feedback are not being used, right? That information that you've provided out of London, Mike, and the one we've done at CCA with many of our partners is currently being used as they evaluate the next step in the process. If the US would be to come back, most likely in early May, and say, well, now we have mass tariff for another 48 hours, something like this. Thank you for the question. Eric Côté, CEGQ.
Pretty much picking up from Mike we've been looking at what's actually inside these materials, what's coming out of. I like the dots, graphs with the dots, the large size of the dots. But one thing we have to consider, all these American products have been, if not counter-tariffed, have been influenced by, I would say, opportunist inflation, I would say.
Yeah.
And if you go to the IPPI index, you clearly see that some products are going high for the last 2 months, 3 months. And a lot of entrepreneurs are talking to reps saying, oh, well, because of tariffs, things are going up. They don't have any proof or counter tariffs that was been paid. It's just opportunity that is there and people are using it. And the only way that we can counteract these things is by asking people, do you have proof that you paid the tariff on this? But we see the ugly thing with the IPPI index, and we see it clearly. And it's some of these things, electrical for one thing, is going up, and the other thing, Mike, you should look at these because I'll send it to you. But all these products, electrical, out of the IPPI, there are 4,000 products, and electrical materials and non-iron metals are all going sky high, contrary to the rest of the average. So there is, in French, we say when there's a wolf free, or whatever it is. So how do you translate that, LP? I don't know.
No, that's a good point. Yeah.
But there is some strictness and some problem with inflation for a certain list of materials. And we've drawn up a list with the government of Quebec, and that has sent it to the federal government too. So, and we've been working with everyone, but we're just pushing the problem further. It's going to happen eventually. And Mike and I will be sad if we're not ready to face the thing. So we do have to work on it somehow to find a solution for that.
I agree. And to your first point, we have received a number of reports of anecdotal evidence of manufacturer and producer that have been using opportunistic measures to increase their price. In some case, delaying, straight out canceling shipment of goods, saying, well, there's too much uncertainty, I need to reevaluate my price, whatnot. We don't have extensive data set of this yet. Of course, it's very recent and very convoluted, but it's an information we brought to public owner and specifically the federal government. So they'd have that in mind, that it's not just a matter of what tariff is being charged at the border, it's also the overall impact on the uncertainty in the market. There's a number of hidden cost increase measure in the tariff discussion. That's something a lot of people don't always realize. We think, oh, I'm importing this from the US, I'll need to pay 25% more. Am I going to pass this to my owner, or am I going to be stuck with the bill? The reality is, even if it's just coming from the US, not even talking about the Canadian market here, before it crossed the border, you'll be faced with a number of inflation measure inside the price of the item, where the actual natural resource used to create that cabinet or metallic fixture might be coming from Canada, being tariff coming in, might be coming from China or other region of the world that has been tariff as well. So there's already a tariff cost even before the Canadian border. There's the change of currency between Canada and the US and how much that will impact your own supply chain. There's the natural market inflation of that uncertainty and change. And all of this get packaged together when you get your quote from your supplier out of the US. And many of these matters also impact the Canadian market, as you pointed out correctly.
Yeah, and I think LP, that's a great point. And also sometimes because of prediction of increased costs, like supply being produced is tightened or limited, which has an effect on pricing in the market more naturally. But I think, and I mentioned it, that I had a discussion with the TD Bank where we didn't have the same forecast at all. They have way more data than I do, but I think because they really have a positive, optimistic perception about the effects on inflation in Canada. And where we had a big gap was, I believe, the input that are required to make some of the imports that Canada will bring from the US. The cost of these inputs are either harder to track for us in Canada, to track directly what it is, but with the approach where it's 10% across the board, there's inputs that we have a hard time thinking about that will be used, whether it's a chemical product or even a different layer of product, whether it's an electrical circuit to go to the final product you're importing. So I think I'm siding with LP on this one, where the input costs will be major, and even if there's a more measured approach on the tariff side, both Canada and US, the inputs that the US are using across the world and putting tariffs on them, that will have an effect on pricing. But is there some people using as a window of opportunity? I'm sure there is, but that's a good advocacy point as well.
Thank you, Charles. Eric, anything else?
No, that's it.
Was it? Great. I will bring up a key example for those that might not be super familiar with the impact we're mentioning here. Take the example of glass. Canada is not a big producer of glass in terms of glass pane for windows or light bulb or whatever. Interestingly enough, the US is by far our main producer and manufacturer here for glass product, but the actual natural resource, silica, comes in great part from Canada. Southern Manitoba, a significant deposit of silica that are extracted, shipped to the US, manufactured there, and transferred back to Canada. If we would have that domestic capacity to manufacture our own glass in the region there, that would be great for both Manitoba and Canada as a whole. But this is the reality we're facing as we're moving away from really much 3 decades of very close free trade partnership between two massive nations, and we need to rethink ourselves and our dependence to the US. I'm mindful of time. We have 3 minutes left before the hour mark, and I don't want to hold you any longer. If there is any additional question, I'm happy to take one more, either in the chat function or with your hand raised. Seeing none. So I think I will wrap this up a few minutes early. Once again, Charles, thank you so much for joining us today for this exceptional edition of the Economic Report from CCA. I invite you all to have a look at our document that is going to be published, and we'll be happy to follow up with you if you have any question on the tariff matter or any of these economic indicators. Thank you all for your time, and I'll see you next quarter.